Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Amelia, and today I want to talk about epic fantasy. What a surprise, I talk about it a lot on this channel, but specifically, there are a lot of epic fantasy series out there that get recommended or that are just floating around, and sometimes it can be hard to decide where to start, what series to pick. There's so many options. So I thought I would make a little video talking about, what did I have here? I think I have 7. Yes, 7 of the most popular epic fantasy series, and sort of give you some idea of which one you should pick. Not specifically explaining like plots and stuff, but more the elements of each that I think would attract a certain type of reader to them. So the series that we're going to talk about today are 1. Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb, Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson. That's right? Yes. Discworld by Terry Pratchett, The World of Austin Ard by Tad Williams, Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson, and finally Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. So let's just go ahead and get right into it. So the series we're going to start with is The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. This is the final book in the first trilogy. I just picked a random one to hold up. Anyway, this is probably my personal favorite epic fantasy series. I just love Hobb's writing, and I think that you should read Realm of the Elderlings if you like character work, and I mean you really like it. The books are definitely still plotty. There are things happening. It's not just a vibes type of series, but I will say that it is heavily focused on the characters. We spend a lot of time in our characters' heads, going over their thoughts, their decisions, all that kind of stuff. And because of that, you need to be able to handle characters who are maybe a little bit annoying and stupid. And then you also need to be able to handle having your heart broken by those very same characters. I would say Realm of the Elderlings is relatively friendly to a more beginner fantasy series type of reader. The world is not insanely complex, especially in the first trilogy. We're kind of very focused in on a specific area. However, as the series goes on and we get into, for example, the Live Ship Traders trilogy, the world gets more complicated. There are more cultures involved as well as more characters. And as I've sort of hinted at, this series is divided into several sub-series within the greater Realm of the Elderlings world. So we have our first series, which is the Farseer trilogy focused on my boy Fitz. And then we get into a few other series, like I said, Live Ship Traders, and then there's also, what is the middle one called? Fitz and the Fool is maybe the second trilogy called? No, or maybe that one's a quartet. Anyway, there are 5 sub-series. So I think that makes it, I think that's another thing that makes it more accessible to a beginning fantasy reader, because it's broken up into these smaller chunks that are more easily digestible and give you an easy break point, as well as, of course, that dopamine hit from actually finishing a series. And you don't have to read these in chronological order. Personally, I read this series first, and then I read the final series, and then I read the ones in the middle. However, I don't specifically recommend that you do that. I think it would be easier to read them in chronological order, and then you're never missing pieces. You don't have to go back and fill in those gaps. And then there is a nautical / pirate trilogy in this series, so need I say more? And then some final bits. You should read Realm of the Elderlings if you like villains who are villains for complicated, realistic reasons, and the way she writes them just makes them all the more villainous, evil, disgusting for it, just because of the way that you could actually see people doing that. And also you like relatively soft magic systems. There are 2 magic systems in this world. They're both quite soft. And finally, and most importantly, you love a good animal companion. This is probably one of the best animal companions I've ever read. Not that I've read too many, but Night Eyes is for sure. He's the best animal companion. All right, next up we have the extremely famous Wheel of Time series, starting with The Eye of the World. Rest in peace, the TV show. But this one's all annotated and pretty. You should read Wheel of Time, if you have it in you to get past Rand being a little bit annoying, and also you're a boob person. So Jordan clearly had a little bit of dated opinions, views, perspectives, whatever you want to call them, and that does come through in this series occasionally, so you have to be able to get past that. And he also mentions breasts about 1 million times in this series, so there is no doubt that he's a boob guy. But that being said, if you want an epic fantasy series in the truest sense of the imagination, this is the series that you have to read. It is a keystone, it is a cornerstone series in the fantasy genre for a reason, and if you are really into fantasy and you haven't read this yet, you definitely should. It took me about 2 years to get through all 14 books, and when I tell you I have never had a book hangover like I did when I finished this series. Like, I finished it and I honestly was in a bit of a daze afterwards. Like, I went to work and I was just like, what am I even doing? Where am I? Because it was just such a, I don't know, when you work towards something for so long, even if it's just like reading it, like obviously you're not writing it, you're just reading it, but still it's such like you spend so much time with the characters in the world that when you finally get to the conclusion, it's hard to beat, honestly. The last 3 books of the series are written by Brandon Sanderson, who one of the series is on this list. And honestly, I don't know if they could have picked anybody better to finish it. I think he did such an amazing job with it. But you should read this series if you like a huge world, an enormous cast of characters, and as I said, there are 14 entries in this series, so it will keep you going for a while. There are a lot of different countries and characters, of course getting varying levels of depth, but each still somehow manages to feel like a unique culture or character. We get a lot of POVs, and there is a lot to unpack for the character motivated reader as well as the world motivated reader. They're relatively balanced, I would say. And similarly, some books are more plotty than others. This series does kind of unfortunately feature a pretty drastic mid-series slump. There are a couple of books where you kind of feel like nothing is getting accomplished, but I think at the end it definitely pays off, and it is worth it to just kind of get through the little bit more of a dip in the series. And once you get past it, things really start to pick up. We've got political intrigue, we've got huge battles between armies as well as magic users, and of course we have a lot of character and relationship development. Wheel of Time honestly kind of has it all. There is something for everyone in here, but I wouldn't say it's the most beginner friendly just because of the scale. Like, there are a lot of different cultures and a lot of named characters who get POVs, so it can be a lot to remember everybody's name. But honestly, if you're willing to pay attention while you're reading, and also just, sometimes you'll forget exactly who a character is, but you just gotta be okay with remembering maybe a few pages later when you figure it out, or it just being like, okay, it's not that important if I remember every bit of how this character is related to that one and this other thing, But sometimes you can't remember every little bit of information, and it's honestly not the end of the world. I wouldn't say the series is going to leave you behind if you forget 1 or 2 minor characters. Also, this might be a slightly unpopular take, but I recommend that you read the prequel novel, New Spring, at the end of the main series, not at the beginning, because I think having all the prior information makes that book, feel more valuable. And also, I read it last, and I thought that it was like a perfect little sort of stepping stone down from my Wheel of Time book hangover to return to the real world. You finish the last one, and it's this whole thing where you've spent all this time reading these 14 books, and you're kind of just like, now what? So if you have that novella to read after, it's like, okay, I'll read this thing, and I'm done. So I recommend reading it at the end, honestly. All right, next up is Malazan, Book of the Fallen. I have book 2 here. I didn't bring book 1 with me to Ottawa, but you should read this series if this ain't your first rodeo. The other 2 series that I've talked about so far, you definitely could read them as a person who hasn't read much epic fantasy before, and you would be totally fine. However, Malazan, I feel like is best appreciated if you've got a couple other fantasy series under your belt already. Kind of the vibe of fantasy world building, plots, characters, that kind of general structure, I think that will help you a lot going into this series because it doesn't hold your hand and you may be confused. I was also confused, and I've read a lot of fantasy, but you know, like I said, sometimes a little bit of confusion is okay. I recently finished Deadhouse Gates. This is book 2, Deadhouse Gates, and it had been probably like 2 years since I read book 1, and I watched a recap video after I got about 50 pages into this because I was like, what is happening? I don't remember anything. And honestly, it still took me like another 100 pages to be like, okay, I fully understand for the most part what's happening here, who everybody is, and where we're going with this, like in a general vibe. So if you do decide to pick it up, I recommend that you don't wait 2 years between the first one and the second one. I think they're probably best consumed maybe like one every couple of months or so that it stays relatively fresh in your mind as there's a lot going on. But that being said, there is a lot to enjoy about this series, but you must be okay with not knowing who you should be rooting for, both on the character level and also on the larger organization, like government type level, as this is definitely very much in the sort of morally gray range. Many of the characters, I would honestly probably say most of the characters are morally gray to some extent, and or just not very pleasant people, unlikable, which can be fine if you are okay with that, but just so you know. But you should read it if you are looking for a very grand, overarching storyline, as long as you're okay with occasionally leaving characters behind in pursuit of that storyline. However, I am, as I said, only on book 2, so I'm not entirely sure if some of the characters who we've left behind are going to come back or not, so that is possible. It also features an interesting magic system where it's kind of based on there are other dimensions and the magic users can like pull power from them, and those dimensions are ruled by gods for the most part. We also have other non-human species, both like demonic type species, as well as like humanoids of various types. So the world is relatively complex in terms of the society because not everybody is human. Okay, next I want to talk about Discworld. I don't have any of them with me, unfortunately, so I don't have a prop to wave around. I'm just gonna have to. But you should read Discworld. If you are looking for a series that you can easily pick up and put down, you want something that's a little bit more lighthearted and fun, less gritty and like grimdark than a lot of modern fantasy, and you like humor that's kind of in the vein, but like not quite that far, I guess I would say, of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's also a good series if you like to have choices. It is kind of divided up into several sort of series. Wow. Okay, storylines that like explore different areas, so you can jump around between them, and there are also standalones, so you can totally mix it up, get a little bit of everything, whatever you're feeling. I think this would make a really good like companion series to one or several other of the series that I've been talking about, to kind of break them up a little bit, because some of them can be quite dark, and then these are just kind of, I don't know, a little bit of a breath of fresh air. I don't know if that's the way I would want to phrase that, but sure, we're gonna go with that. And you will be fed for a long time if you choose this series. It is probably one of the longest fantasy series that there is, with 41 books. So you're good for a while. I've only actually read one so far, and that is Going Postal. So I can't speak too much more on Discworld, but there it is. Okay, next up we have Tad Williams' World of Osten-Ard. This is the final book in The Last King of Osten-Ard. It's the only one I have with me. But this series is for you if you like fantasy that has a very kind of classic fantasy vibe that pulls a lot of references from real world like politics and culture. So the World of Osten-Ard consists of the original trilogy, which is Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Then there are 2 novellas, and then finally the more modern series, or more recent series, The Last King of Osten-Ard, ending with Navigator's Children. I think you would like the series. If you like writing that can be a relatively long-winded, we get quite a bit of descriptions of the world, as well as a lot of time spent in characters' heads. The first series specifically, you might like it if you like a underdog coming of age type of story, as that series focuses a lot on its main character, Simon, who starts out as a kitchen boy, and I won't tell you where he ends up. But in contrast with Malazan, I think this is a good series if you're a little bit tired of the morally gray characters and you just want the good guys to be good and the bad guys to be bad. Although I will say that after the first series, that does get a little bit more murky, but definitely not as murky as something like Malazan. They're much more still good and bad. You might also like it if you like Tolkien's elves, but wish that they had an evil winter counterpart, which is represented in this series by the Sithi, who are kind of like the good version, and the Jediah, who are the evil winter elves. For me, as I said, the first series is very much about Simon and his personal journey, more so than it is about like the overarching plot, although there is, a lot happening in terms of the plot. But I would say that one is more of a character study, more character focused, whereas in the second one, second series, it feels more like a modern fantasy series, which does make sense as Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn is published starting in 1988 and the early 90s, whereas this series is much more modern with the first book coming out in 2017. So it is kind of interesting to go from the first series to the second series because you're getting like a classic fantasy and you're getting a modern fantasy all set in the same world. This definitely does still have kind of classic fantasy vibes. The whole world was already built, obviously, back then, and he's just returning to it. So if you like classic fantasy vibes, it does continue, but it does feel more modern. I do think Osten Ard is a relatively beginner-friendly series, as in series 1 especially. Like, the plot and the world aren't too complicated. It gets a little more complicated in the second series, just because we focus on more characters and stuff like that, but it's still relatively straightforward, I would say. So it is beginner-friendly, but it is quite long, so that is something to be aware of. All right, now we're going to talk about Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This is one of the most popular fantasy series currently. I don't know where it ranks in terms of all time, but if you read into fantasy, you know who Sanderson is. You've heard of Stormlight Archive, but maybe you haven't read it yet, and you're trying to decide if you should. So, you should read Stormlight Archive if you like sad boy main characters, hard magic, and unique world building. I would say those are like the big things about this series. Sanderson spends quite a bit of time explaining the world, cultures, and the magic rules. He's very good at doing world building and explaining it all in a way that doesn't feel super info dumpy, but you can tell that he spent a lot of time and effort coming up with this world and all the little details of it, and he wants you to know that. So if you don't find world building interesting, I don't know if you will love Stormlight, because it's a big part of it. But other than world building, I would say Stormlight is relatively balanced in terms of plot and character work. You do spend a lot of time in characters' heads as they sort of work through their own thoughts and personal challenges. All of the characters have something going on and they're working through it. But there is a lot going on in the plot and the world too, so I feel like it's pretty balanced, honestly. Each book is very long. This is the first one. It is the shortest one. I don't know if you can see behind me, but they just pretty much get progressively longer up until Wind and Truth. But honestly, they aren't orders of magnitude longer than the books in any of the other series on this list, other than maybe Discworld. Like, you can see, this is a pretty long book as well, and the final book in the first trilogy of Osten Ard is actually one of the longest novels ever written, and is commonly published as 2 books. So you could say it's a quartet, but it's a trilogy. It was intended to be a trilogy, unlike Lord of the Rings. I think you'll like Stormlight if you like a large cast of characters and reading lots of different POVs. There is like a core main group of characters who we get the most POVs from, but we often get POVs from other sort of random characters as it contributes to like the overall story, which is kind of similar to Wheel of Time, actually. I don't know if maybe he picked up that kind of from Robert Jordan, who would just give you a random POV that tells you something about the world or what the bad guys are doing. You also do need to like morally gray characters for this series. and also morally great institutions, countries, whatever you want to call them. And you have to be okay with questioning your own beliefs and perspectives on characters who you might get more information on later in the series that doesn't back up what you got at the beginning. I think that makes sense, maybe. And it also, Stormlight also does touch a little bit on Sanderson's greater Cosmere universe. So it helps. From my understanding, I hadn't really read much of the Cosmere before I read Stormlight, but people say you will pick up on more things if you have read other Cosmere books, but I don't think it's necessary. You might miss a few things, but I don't think it's, like I said, it didn't really, I don't think, impact my enjoyment of the series. So take that as you will, I suppose. But this is definitely the series for you if you like large-scale stuff, as almost the entire planet of Roshar gets involved on one side or other of the conflict. And yeah, I think that kind of sums up the most important elements of Stormlight. All right, and then finally, George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, often known as Game of Thrones. You should read this series if you like cliffhangers.